Thank you so much, Fazil. And thank you everybody for making the time to come this evening. My name's Annalise Van Diemen. I'm one of the public health doctors at the North Eastern Public Health Unit. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting this evening and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And as Fazil mentioned, we're the North Eastern Public Health Unit. We are where our team are the ones that do the contact tracing for the northeastern regions of Melbourne, and that stretches all the way from St Vincent's Hospital, sort of in the eastern part of Melbourne, all the way up to the catchment of the northern hospitals, so up to the Hume and Whittlesea areas, and then out to the east towards the Yarra Ranges. So it's a big area and lots of people, and a very broad and diverse range of people in that area as well. But obviously we're here tonight to talk about the COVID cases and outbreak that's happened at Al Sarat, which we're very happy to say does seem to be on the other end now, going downwards instead of going upwards, which is absolutely all thanks to yourselves and the school's management of it. But I think there was a few things that we were hoping to clarify with you as a school community as part of that outbreak. So to summarise the situation where we are at the moment, there has been a total of 115 confirmed cases, but that has been since sort of a few dotted throughout September and October, and then a real sort of group in November, which I can show you a picture of in a moment. But at this point in time, there are currently only 42 active cases. So the majority of the cases in your school community are now cleared and finished and are all free to come back to school. One of the reasons why we thought it was important to come and speak tonight is because your school outbreak occurred in the midst of the changeover of contact tracing that happened, where we really moved as an entire state from a place where we were intensely managing outbreaks in schools and cases in schools, and many of you will have experienced that when there was a case in your child's classroom that your child had to go home and quarantine for 7 days or 14 days. And as the state did such a magnificent job in people over 12 all going to get their vaccines, and we hit the 80% double vaccinated and then the 90% double vaccinated, that gave us a real opportunity, together with our colleagues at the Department of Health and Education and Schools, to really look at how we were managing cases of COVID in schools, and to really try and focus, as Fazil said, on keeping schools open and maximising opportunities for kids to stay at school in those last couple of weeks, particularly noting that we know COVID it does spread sometimes in schools, and we've seen that, but that young children have much less severe disease than adults and are much, much less likely to end up in hospital. So I wanted to first acknowledge that changeover happened right in the middle of your outbreak, and you had a number of classes where there'd been a couple of classes where there'd been quite a few cases, and that there were children who were finishing off their quarantine time, and that the rules sort of changed in the middle of that time, and we had to make a decision to look at some of our outbreaks that had bigger numbers of cases as to whether we would finish that quarantine time or not. And in the case of Al Sarat, for that group, we decided to finish the quarantine because there had been so many cases in those particular classes. So for a lot of you, you will have had students, your children, who had to do that 7 or 14 days of quarantine. Sister Leah has confirmed today that all of those classes have now finished their quarantine time, which is great. And I wanted to confirm with you what the process will be now if there's any new cases. But firstly, I just wanted to show you a little bit of a picture that shows you what the outbreak has looked like at your school. Is it possible for me to share my screen? Oh, there it is. Leah, are you able to allow me to share my screen to show a little picture? Is that possible or not? If not, it doesn't really matter. We'll try in a second. While we're doing that, I'll quickly talk about what the new process is, which I think will be good news to all of you. So from now on, if there is a exposure in your child's classroom, for example, if your child is in grade 3 and a child is at school who has COVID, which is happening, across the state, we have hundreds of schools that have exposures on any given day. It does not now mean that your child will have to quarantine for 2 weeks. Now the requirements are much less harsh and hopefully less onerous. The requirement now, if there's been a contact in your school, in your child's class, is that your child gets a PCR test to make sure it hasn't already spread in the class. We recommend when your child gets that PCR test that you ask for one of the rapid antigen test kits, the RAT kits that are available at the big testing centres. And then once your child has a negative swab from the test up the nose, they're able to return to school. And we're recommending that you do the home testing kit on the next sort of 5 days that your child goes to school. But that's not compulsory, but it's recommended just to be sure that your child hasn't caught COVID from that exposure in their classroom. But we're definitely no longer requiring that contacts do that 2 weeks. I will, going to share, and hopefully I'll share the right one. Yep, I think that's it. Can you see a little graph there? No, just have to try again. Sorry. It seems that my Mac doesn't want to allow Zoom to share my screen. What I was going to show you is a really lovely picture that our epidemiologists have put together. And what it shows is what we call an epi curve. And it's really just a graph of the cases on any given day. And it shows that the majority of the cases in El Serrat happened really between the 14th and sort of the 26th, 27th of November, so over that 2-week period. And it goes from a couple a day, goes right up to, there's one day where there's sort of 12 or 13. And on those sort of 10 days, there's anywhere between 4 or 5 and 10 cases. And they're quite clustered. And then it is starting to very clearly taper off. So what that means is that hopefully we have found most, if not all, of the cases in the students, and there was a couple of teachers, but not many at El Serrat. The other thing that it shows is it's a coloured graph that shows us, and I can send this to the school if that's helpful. Shows which grade the children are in, and the vast majority are in grade 5 or 6. And when we looked at gender, it actually showed that the vast majority are in the grade 5 and 6 girl classes. So what that showed to us is that actually was quite a concentrated outbreak in those couple of classes, but it is really tapering off now. So that's really good news. So in terms of the situation, I'll leave it at that and can answer any questions that come up later if necessary. Back to what the current situation is in terms of requirements, if there's any new cases in other classes, it really is that immediate test in order to get back to school. And what we find that does is that finds the majority of new cases in a class, and it means that we're then able to sort of stamp things out pretty quickly, which is good. and for you to then be very vigilant about any symptoms in your children and get them tested again if they develop symptoms or become unwell. The reason why we're still asking for kids to get tested, even though they may not be getting very unwell, is that we do still have adults in the population and some, you know, older children particularly, who are vulnerable to getting severe disease. So we still are seeing people admitted to hospital with COVID. We're still seeing people in the intensive care unit with COVID. And what we're really aiming to do is to keep COVID away from those people who might become very unwell as much as possible. The good news is obviously the Victorian community in general, but particularly the communities of the north have done a really brilliant job, and we're really very, very grateful to all of you who've gone out and got vaccinated, and we've seen the impact that has had, because when we were getting 1,000 cases a day before we had such high vaccination rates, our hospitalisation rates were doing this, and now that our vaccination rates have gone so far up, the people going into hospital has really gone down, and that's the way we're very much hoping to keep it. I suppose our request is that the best way we can sort of prevent vulnerable people who are still in the community from getting COVID is for us to find cases early, and to have those people not potentially exposing our older population or our people who might be having cancer therapy or who are unable to get a vaccine because of a medical condition. So that's our best strategy now, is finding all of those cases as early as possible. And the final thing I just wanted to touch on, and we've already touched on a little bit, is would encourage any people who are eligible for vaccination, who might still be on the fence or still thinking about it and still uncertain, to have a conversation with your local GP. There's also quite a few of our local community health services that have got some really expert people in there who are also able to have a conversation with you if you've got any ongoing concerns or things that you'd like to discuss about getting a vaccination. We've got many very experienced people around in the north that if there's any desire for that, we can provide some names and some contacts of people who can provide information about that in certain languages or from certain religious backgrounds, if that's something that is would be of interest to people. So look, I might leave it there and hand back over to Fazil and Leah to for any questions that people might have.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Annalise. That was very good.
Annalise, there have been some great questions on the Q&A, which I've been answering, like really good questions. So I've just been answering them live while you've been talking around some of these restrictions, and yeah.
So the first one there, I think, is probably worth speaking to, and I meant to say actually, which is a really great question. What if your child has already had COVID? If you or your child has already had COVID before, you are considered immune from COVID for 90 days after your first test. So that is another reason actually why it's good to find out if you have COVID, because what it means is you can't be called a contact for another 90 days. You don't have to go home and get a test. You don't have to miss more days of school or work. If you get pinged because you've been at a restaurant when there was a case there, you can ignore it. As much as we don't want people to get COVID, absolutely, once you have had COVID, you're probably one of the safest people in the state for the next 90 days, because you're absolutely immune. Your immunity does start waning after that though, which is why it's important to get a vaccine, even if you have had COVID, because we're seeing in all international countries, we're seeing reinfections happen to people who've had COVID before. But if your child has had COVID, particularly if your child's had COVID and the school's not aware of it, they can't know to not make your child a contact. So it's a good thing to let the school know that your child has had COVID, so that they don't send them home again if there happens to be another exposure in their class.
One question I had is that sometimes when a person's had COVID, then there's a delay in them getting the vaccine. So a lot of places now require a person to be double vaccinated to enter. So do they just have to wait it out? Because obviously, they're exempt from the vaccine, but people aren't accepting exemptions, they're just accepting a double vaccination pass.
Yeah, so people are eligible for an exemption if they don't wish to get a vaccine after they've had COVID, but they can absolutely still get vaccinated. So they're not banned from the vaccination, so to speak. But if you've had COVID, you can get a certificate for the exemption from your GP, and that can then get loaded into the MyGov, the app that then talks to your Vic Services Vic app. The only way to do that is through a GP. So we don't have access to that system because it's a federal system, the immunisation register, and therefore the exemption register. So in order to be exempt, so to speak, from the double vaccination rule to get into places, you need to have got that certificate. Or you can still go ahead and get a vaccine. And particularly, we have had a lot of questions about people who've had one vaccine and then they get COVID. Can you get another vaccine, your second vaccine afterwards? Yes, absolutely you can. As long as your symptoms have resolved and you're feeling well, and you've been cleared from your infection, which is 10 days after the test, you can get the second vaccine.
There's just a question about will vaccines be mandated at school? Do you have any information in regards to that?
It's a really good question. It's highly unlikely that vaccines will be mandated in schools. So whilst they're mandated, some vaccines, some of the early childhood vaccines are mandated for childcare. You'll note that there's no mandatory vaccines for primary and secondary school. And that's related to international law and human rights law, that it's not appropriate to deny a child their education because of a decision that they haven't made, or a decision not to get a vaccine. So yeah, not likely at all that they will be mandated for schools. I'd be very surprised, in fact, if that happened. I can't speak. I'm not at all involved in the policy decisions about whether vaccines will be mandated for entry to places in the same way as they are for adults once they become available for children. I'm not sure. I'm honestly not sure about that one. We did also see a question. There's also a question in there about when vaccines will be available for children. And I think what Lenny has said is that it's unlikely to be until sort of early in the new year that they become approved for children in Victoria. That was the latest report that I heard from the national body looking at vaccinations. But Lenny, did you want to speak to that? You're a bit more involved in the vaccine world than I am.
Yeah, so hi everyone, thanks for giving us the opportunity to speak. So my name's Lenny. I am actually one of the doctors that works with Annalise at the North Eastern Public Health Unit, but I also work as an infectious diseases paediatrician at the Royal Children's Hospital. I think in terms of the vaccine stuff, so there's been a lot of talk about whether or not 5 to 11-year-olds need to be vaccinated. And I think just from a safety perspective, what we know is, as Annalise said, that children, when they get COVID, it's like any other viral illness. They get a bit of a fever, they might be unwell for a couple of days, but generally they are actually okay. So they get mild disease compared to the adults, where we know that, particularly internationally, we've seen that adults who have no other medical conditions can actually become very unwell with COVID. And so vaccination really has been to protect the adults within our populations, and also, I guess, the older individuals who, you know, because of their age, have greater risk factors for severe disease with COVID, and also protecting those who actually can't get vaccinated because, you know, they might have cancer and they're on chemotherapy, for example, or they are actually, yeah, they can't actually receive it. The other thing I just wanted to emphasize is from a hospital perspective, what we're seeing in terms of children who are going to hospital is that they are children who have other underlying medical conditions. So the ones that we've seen in hospital have been children who have had underlying sort of heart problems from birth, or lung problems from birth. And then in the older children, so above sort of that 12 to 13 year age, is that we're seeing children who are very overweight. So people, you know, children who are, you know, typically 110, 120 kilos, they're the ones that are sort of running into trouble with severe COVID disease and ending up in our intensive care units. So just, I guess, on one hand, trying to reassure everyone that, you know, we're vaccinating people who are at higher risk. So, you know, the greater than 12s and the adults. And then, you know, if your child unfortunately does get exposed to COVID or contracts COVID and they are young, that most will be okay. Fazil and Leah, other questions?
Okay, it looks like that our questions are sort of drying up at the moment.
Thank you for your time. It's been enlightening for us, and it's good to explain about, you know, the testing requirements, in particular the best practice of the rapid antigen test for the 5 days afterwards, because as we know in the past that some students, they don't become positive until the 6th day when they go and get a test. So I think that's quite important. And yeah, so, and we don't know much about the new variant and if this vaccine will protect us.
Yeah, that's a tricky thing actually at the moment, is that it's very unknown. We know we've had a couple of cases in Sydney already, no cases yet in Melbourne. Reasonably confident that there has genuinely been no cases, because we are still, whilst we're not doing what we call genomic sequencing on every single case, they're doing sort of 15% of cases. So we'll just have to watch this space, really. The two big questions, I think, for now, some people are saying Omicron and some people are saying Omicron, and I'm still a little bit confused, but Lenny might have confirmation there. Some of the big questions, it does seem to be spreading even faster than Delta in South Africa, which is concerning. But it's unclear, particularly because South Africa has lower vaccination rates than Victoria. It's unclear at the moment whether that variant will have what we call immune escape. So it will escape the vaccine, or whether it will escape people's immunity from other recent infection. And we're also not sure about what we call its virulence. So that's how bad it is, whether it causes more severe disease or different disease than Delta or the original strains that came through last year. So it is one of the really difficult things, I think, about how fantastic the world is now about sharing information so quickly. We know that it exists, but we just don't know very much about it yet, because there's literally not been enough time to gather enough true information to determine what the deal is really with Omicron, so or Omicron. So I'm sure, you know, we'll all be watching it very closely. to see what happens.
There was another question by a parent in regards to how come some students need to wear face masks and others don't. And it's the year 3 to 6 cohort that still needs to continue to wear the face mask, and foundation to year 2, it's preferred, but we don't enforce that because they're such young students. And I believe it's about the vaccination rate for the 12 years and up, because once they hit year 7, they're usually 12 years, and that's why. And there's also another one, another question about how long, when you have COVID, how long will you still test positive for? And if you could just answer that, that would be great.
Yeah, and look, to be honest, the mask thing is also just a practical thing. Like the grade preps, particularly the little ones, are not going to be very good at keeping a mask on. I know it's almost impossible to keep a mask on my prep kid. So that's sort of just realism about not making impossible requests of teachers and parents to keep masks on little kids who are just bad at doing that in general. The other thing, and this is somewhat anecdote, but I think it is also backed up by the information, is that we are seeing more cases in older kids than we're seeing in younger kids. Whether that's the younger kids are getting it and not testing positive because they're clearing it really, really quickly, but it's almost the reverse of what we normally see in the general coughs and colds, that little kids get heaps of them when they're in daycare and when they're in early primary school. And that seems to sort of taper off as they hit later primary school. We are seeing more cases in later primary school than we are in early primary school and daycare. So another one of those things that, probably in 3 or 4 years' time, we'll understand exactly why that is, but we don't necessarily understand that right now, but it is something that we're observing. Sorry, Leah, I've just forgotten what the second question. Oh, how long are you going to test positive? So anywhere from you can stop testing positive very quickly when you're infected, up until we've had people test positive for 90 days or more after their infection. That tends to be people who have got what we call immune suppression, so people who are on cancer therapy or other drugs that suppress their immune system, and that's the system that gets rid of the virus. But we know people shed virus for a very long time, which doesn't mean that they're infectious and giving it to people. It just means that bits of dead virus hang around in your nose and in your throat, sometimes in your gut, come out in your poo for a very long time. And that's a common thing across a lot of diseases. And again, it's a reason why we say if you've had COVID in the last 90 days, don't go and get another test, because there's a chance it comes back positive, gets very confusing. Somebody from the department calls you and says you've got COVID, and you say, oh no, but I had COVID 3 weeks ago. And it can be distressing for everybody. If for some reason that does happen though, we will absolutely sort it out and clear you. We have, recently found out about a family in our area who didn't realise there'd been some communication breakdowns and had been isolating at home for much longer than they needed to, because they kept getting tests and then the test would come back positive even though they were no longer infectious. So we absolutely, our mission, in the words of our boss, Paul, is no longer to eliminate COVID. We know COVID is here and it's around and it's in the community. Our mission right now is to protect the people who are most vulnerable and to minimize the disruption on the lives of everybody else, including your children being at school, but also you being at work and you being able to live your life in society. And we don't always get that 100% right. Sometimes the balance tips the wrong way in one way or another, and it will be a balance for some time to come, because we know COVID's not going away absolutely anytime soon. But that is definitely our aim, is to be sensible and compassionate, and to mitigate true risk where there is true risk, and to try and keep COVID infection away from the really vulnerable people, and to hopefully then enable everybody else to just get on with the lives that have been so interrupted for the last 2 years. So we really thank you for your patience as that has been, as we've got to that point. I know it's been a very difficult road for many of you.
Annalise, I just wanted to add your shedding time. So the time that you're positive for if you are infected with COVID is generally reduced if you are vaccinated as well. So just to be aware of that, and which is why you're less likely to infect other people if you're double vaccinated. And that's why we go on and on about double vaccination status.
And I suppose that's one thing that we haven't really touched on much. We expect to see increasing numbers of cases in people who are double vaccinated, because 90% of the population over 12 are now double vaccinated. So we know that breakthrough infections are going to happen. It happens across most infectious diseases for which there's a vaccine. We see it in flu, we see it in whooping cough, we see it in lots of infections. But what that double vaccination is doing is we still have almost nobody in our ICUs who is double vaccinated, and very, very few people and who are dying are double vaccinated. It still happens very occasionally, but generally it's been people who are very old and very frail or otherwise very unwell with something else. So healthy people who are double vaccinating almost never end up in hospital at all. And if they do end up in hospital, they essentially never end up in ICU or as part of the group who have died from COVID. So it is a really good sign that since those vaccines have come in, that those hospitalisation rates have been going down, which was what we were all hoping for the last 18 months.
We have a question from one of the participants. I've got, is it Faiza has their hand up? Fazil or Leah, how would you like to take the question? Are they able to unmute?
I'll just have a look, see if I can unmute. I don't see anyone with a hand up.
Just written an apology.
Oh, okay. I can share my screen if you like with the infographic. If you like.
Yeah, and while you do that, Aish has just asked a question about the booster. So Aish, if I'm correct, oh, sorry, we'll just might have a talk about this one and then I'll answer Aish's question. So look, as I described, you can see really here that there was a big spike sort of in mid-November. There was some ongoing cases. And as you can see, the year level most impacted really has been the 5s and 6s, with a smattering in sort of into the 2 and 3 year level, but really not so many in the 7, 8 and 9 year level. And that you can see with the eye of faith, as one of my lecturers used to say, that curve is going downwards now, and there's been many fewer cases in the last couple of days. So that's really great news for the school community that's gone down, and it does sort of show that that sort of older primary school age seems to be more impacted really than the younger kids in this outbreak particularly.
There was another picture. Was it 2 different infographics or just the one?
There's 2 there. The other one you can share if you, I'll leave that up to you. That does break it down into classrooms, Leah.
Okay,
so you guys might want to keep that to yourself, or if you want to share it, that's fine as well. It just identifies which class breaks down the grade 5, 6s into the 3 or 4, 5, 6 classes, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Just takes a little bit longer to get your head around because there's so many different colors. But what you can see there is, these 2 purple colors, 5 and 6G purple colors really do have sort of the biggest numbers. So it does seem to have spread pretty effectively through the grade 5 and 6 girls, and then been a lot more sort of sporadic into other classrooms with sort of 2 or 3 cases in in most of the other classrooms where there was a case. I see Aisha's asked a question about the booster for people who had side effects of the COVID vaccine. That might be an individual question for you to speak to your health practitioner about, because it probably depends on what those side effects were. So we know that certainly the Pfizer vaccine, people tended to get more significant, flu-like symptoms for a day or two afterwards. If you had that, where you just where you felt like you had the flu, felt like you'd been hit by a truck and were then okay, definitely still recommending the booster dose. That's an definite expected and not dangerous side effect of the Pfizer. If you had one of the rarer side effects, or you had to seek medical attention for your side effect after a second dose, we'd recommend you have a chat to your GP about timing and which vaccine booster to get, because there's various different combinations of vaccines and boosters. So your GP would probably be best placed to have a chat with you about that for sure.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to acknowledge your time, Dr. Annalise and Dr. Linny, because I know it's a very busy time in the health world at the moment. So we really appreciate your taking the time out for the college community tonight. That's greatly appreciated, and thank you very much.
No worries at all. That's our job, and thank you all for coming with such short notice. We really appreciate it, and thank you for all the work you've all done to really control this outbreak. It's been a great effort.
Thank you very much. So inshallah, with that, I just saw one last question come through about
a good question.
I think that's already been answered. We're just sort of waiting and seeing. Is that correct?
Very much.
I wish we knew. Yeah, we are just waiting, and we're trying very hard to find it if it does make its way into Victoria, and shut it down pretty quickly while we don't really know, because we don't really know much about it. So we are sort of on an elimination train for the Omicron variant. So yeah, we will, if there does happen to be cases in Victoria, we'll try very hard to shut those down while we're still figuring out exactly what Omicron means for all of us.